chickens, history, the social part, the part about working with each other in order to make this management work. And our next speaker is going to be talking about pollinators, which, unless you've been under a rock, have not heard that pollinators are decreasing nationwide, worldwide, for a variety of reasons. So our next speaker is going to be talking about bees are not optional. We all benefit from pollinator conservation. So our next speaker is Karin Jokela. She's a pollinator conservation planner and partner biologist based in southeast Minnesota. She collaborates with the Natural Resource Conservation Service staff in Minnesota and Wisconsin to provide individual consulting to farmers on habitat restoration and pollinator-friendly farm management practices, and serves as an advisor to staff of other conservation organizations. Karin received her MS in ecology from Iowa State University. She and her husband are also organic vegetable farmers in Cannon Falls, Minnesota. I'm very happy to introduce this afternoon Karin Jokela. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I kind of dance a lot when I give presentations, so hopefully if I step away you can still hear me. If you can't hear me, just kind of do this. All right, so as she was saying, as Sharon was saying, yeah, pollinator conservation is kind of a household conversation these days. And in this room in particular, I'm guessing that a lot of you are pretty well versed in this. And so sometimes when I talk to conservation groups like this, I like to start off by saying, use this as an opportunity to refine your talking points. You might know a lot of the material that I'm presenting here, but it might be presented in a slightly different way, or just use it as a chance to kind of think through it and refine the way that you talk about it, because we need to be talking about this a lot more than we already are. So, right, bees are not optional, and I'm going to introduce some of our native pollinators and the habitat needs they have and how we can all take part in their conservation. Oh yeah, turn it on the side. Turn it on the side. All right. All right. So I do like to start with the acknowledgements just because sometimes at the end we get rushed and it's so important. So first and foremost, thank you to the organizing committee. This is really a fun event. The Wisconsin Farm Bill biologists who have been roping me into some of the cool stuff you guys are doing here in Wisconsin. And then I also have to say, my executive director would want me to say that the Xerces Society is a member-based organization, much like public radio is, and your membership support really does a lot to promote our work on the ground. A little bit about the Xerces Society. We're a non-profit, science-based organization working to protect invertebrates and their habitat. We are based in Portland, Oregon, but we have staff kind of all over the country. We take our name from the Xerces blue butterfly. This is the first butterfly in North America to go extinct that we know of due to human-influenced habitat loss. So we started as a butterfly conservation organization and have since kind of taken on all invertebrates and their protection. And habitat implementation and restoration is really like the main way that we carry out our mission. We have several programs. Our Pollinator and Agricultural Biodiversity program is the program for which I work. It's probably our biggest program, and we have the most people on the ground doing that work. We also have a really awesome endangered species team that's doing cool work on monarchs, bumblebees, freshwater mussels, so some of our most imperiled invertebrates. We also have a really great pesticide policy team, so if that's something that kind of interests you, I encourage you to reach out to them. They've done a lot of work to support municipalities and create best management practices and that kind of thing. And then I kind of hesitate to even say it, but we just started an urban conservation program, so if you're working in residential areas, this is something to kind of keep on your radar as it starts to grow. We just have a couple pilot projects going on the West Coast. And a little bit about my role, specifically, my position is funded by a partnership between the Xerces Society, General Mills, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. So that's the NRCS. It's the branch of the USDA that's responsible for helping farmers with conservation. And much like, if you're familiar with these farm bill piles, just I keep pointing to Becky and Tally over here, I work with farmers to develop habitat plans. I work with the NRCS offices as they work with producers. I work at the state level to help refine program standards for pollinator habitat. I make seed mixes. I just do kind of a lot of work on multiple different levels. And I'm available. I'm based in Minnesota, but I am available to come out and assist with any farm habitat related projects in Wisconsin as well. And just to kind of get a sense of the audience, how many farmers are in here? Anybody? A few farmers, okay. Not many, okay. Okay, well, that's important to know, and I will kind of reframe a few slides here as we move forward. And before I move on into the real content, I do want to just mention that we have a ton of resources. Our organization really devotes a lot of time to developing these amazing technical guides that assist you in making sure your restoration is off to a good start with plant lists, really best management practices, lots of cool information. It's also all available online for free as downloadable PDFs. So, okay. So the outline, I just want to talk about the importance of pollinators and invertebrates in general. I'll try to sprinkle in a little information about where things are relevant to prairie chickens, although I will be the first to admit I'm really not a game bird specialist, so forgive me. But I'm going to try to get you on board with all of the charismatic insects too. Okay, so and then we're going to get to know some of these pollinators, think about a few opportunities for habitat development for them, and then do this conservation update and kind of call to action. So it's the section where we talk about all the recent insect decline news, kind of the depressing stuff, but I'm going to try to not leave you feeling depressed. I'm going to try to flip that and make you feel encouraged to go out and do something about all this. So that's kind of where we're headed. First, I want to address this important reality, which is we spend a lot of time thinking about wildlife conservation, and what comes to our mind is generally vertebrate animals, right? Pandas, tigers, in this room, prairie chickens, and other birds. But really, when we think about animal diversity, the vast majority of the diversity on this planet are arthropods and insects, and yet they are getting very little funding for conservation. But they are so important. They are doing so much work for us, but also just for ecosystems in general. They are recycling nutrients throughout the system. This is terrestrial systems as well as aquatic systems. They are offering free pest control services for farmers, but for all of us. They are doing the very important service of turning plant material into very nutritious food for birds, like prairie chickens. I'd like to give this little story about chickadees. Some of you might even know these numbers from Doug Tallamy. But basically, Doug Tallamy, he tells a story about how chickadees need anywhere from 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch. And that over 3 weeks, might take 3 weeks to raise these little birds, these chicks. And that's, if you break that down, that's about 450 caterpillars per day that those birds need. And if you think about that in an entire landscape, that's a lot of insects that we need in our landscape to raise these other birds. And actually, my criteria for voting on these prairie chicken illustrations were whichever one had the most insects in their prairie system is the one that I voted for. Okay, and then finally, what we're going to really focus here on is that insects help plants produce. And that's where the service that we'll focus on for the rest of the time. We know pollinators are an ecological keystone. Usually we think about ecological species or keystone species, but this is really a group of animals. A keystone species basically means if those animals were to disappear from the system, it would fall apart, right? And we know that 85% of flowering plants on Earth require an animal to move pollen from one flower to the other. Usually that animal is an insect, and usually that insect is a bee. And this is where most of us start the conversation about pollinator conservation, and I'm obliged to start here too, because it's the human-centric way to talk about it. Pollinators are important because we like to eat diverse food, and it's important to our economic system. All of our most valuable kind of nutrients and interesting coffee, fruits, vegetables, the diversity and interest in our diet comes from pollinator-dependent plants. But I also need to step away from that, especially with this kind of audience. You guys are interested in conservation for conservation's sake, right? So these are the other reasons why it's worthwhile to get into pollinator conservation, because these systems that we enjoy and we recreate in are dependent on pollinators. Without pollinators, we would not have these wildflowers and the resiliency built into these systems. They would kind of shift into more wind-pollinated communities, like just grasslands without wildflowers, right? Getting into the pollinators as a group. When we think about pollinators, we have this umbrella term of pollinators that encompasses butterflies, moths, flies, wasps, beetles, and bees. But bees are objectively the most important pollinators, and I'm wondering if anybody in here can kind of shout out why bees are the most important. I know you guys know.
Which kind of bees?
Any bees. Why are bees more important than like a butterfly, for example? The picture kind of gives you some hints.
Really good at carrying pollen.
They're good at carrying pollen, yeah, totally. This one's carrying a lot of pollen. They actually pick up pollen. Some of them are so, like bumblebees, they'll kind of create some electricity and kind of that picks up pollen when they land on the flower.
So
But-
does it have something to do with the fact that they're picking up a lot of this material on their bodies? And is that pollen I see on the side of the bee, that's not only what they transport in their mouth, they collect a lot of pollen all over their body.
The pollen is really the key, and I think you're getting at that. The pollen, these are the only animals that actively collect the pollen at all, they need that pollen at all stages of their life cycle. So before I even give you the second bullet point, I'm going to bring you back to this photo. So right there are all these pollinators, which we might call flower visitors. Right? They visit flowers, they move around pollen, thereby pollinating plants. But bees are the most important because they're actively collecting that pollen to bring back to their young. Like these insects, butterfly caterpillars are eating vegetation, right? They don't need the pollen when they're young. Same with a lot of these others that are more omnivorous or have different food needs. Bees eat pollen as young, and they eat pollen and nectar as adults as well. So they're completely dependent on pollen. The other reason why they are so important is that they exhibit what's called floral constancy. So they visit the same species of flower over and over and over again. So in the spring, for example, you're not going to get a bee that visits an apple blossom and then a dandelion and then a willow. They're going to go from an apple to an apple to an apple. And once those apple resources are depleted, then it might shift to a new species if they're a generalist. But from a plant's perspective, if you're an apple, you don't want willow pollen on your flower. You want apple pollen on your reproductive parts, right? So that's why they are exceptional pollinators. Okay, And they have specialized pollen collecting hairs, and it can look kind of different in different types of bees. This one down here, let's see if I can point it. This is the honeybee, kind of makes this little pollen ball. Bumblebees do a pretty similar thing. Some bees carry pollen like on their belly or up in their armpits. Lots of different ways to carry pollen around. And then I have to make this note here about honeybees. So when we think about pollinator conservation, a lot of us conjure up this picture of a honeybee. But what I'm here to kind of promote and tell you about is all the diversity of native bees that we have here. Honeybees are a European species, and while fascinating animals with this really complex, sophisticated system, and undeniably extremely important for our agricultural system, they are not at threat of extinction. So I think mistakenly some people hear about the pollinator declines and they feel the crisis and the urgency, and they decide to take up beekeeping. And really, as the Xerces Society, we promote wildlife conservation. We are kind of trying to gently say, grow your own native bees that can also provide really good pollination services. And that contributes more to general wildlife conservation. Okay, so to recognize some of this bee diversity, we've got 3,600 species just in the United States, over 4,000 or 5,000 on the continent. Estimates are about 25,000 species worldwide. Yeah, I can hear some of you guys think, yeah. This is just to illustrate that. This is the smallest bee in North America on the top of the head of the largest bee in North America. So this is Perdita on top of a Xylocova or a carpenter bee. And actually I like this photo, and this is maybe a problem because you guys are up back there. But up here you can see some of those branched hairs that make pollen easier to collect on bees. And I have to throw this one in too, just to show that these bees come in a rainbow of colors. They are gorgeous. And once you get to know them, you can have those, you can love them the way that you love bird chickens. I mean, when you start to recognize them and see their beauty, you know, it's really endearing. Okay, so just some of the aesthetics of bees. But it's kind of daunting, actually, to think about all of these different bee species. How are we ever going to get to know them all, right? And so when I work with land managers and farmers, this is the way that I like to break it down, because it's easier for you to get your head around that. So there are basically 3 different types of native bees that you can categorize into their nesting habitats. And the easy thing is that 70% of them are ground nesting. They're solitary bees, so when you think of ground nesting bees, probably you're thinking of like yellow jackets or something. These are solitary bees that have their own nest, that they're not living in a community. We also have stem nesting bees. They live also in a solitary lifestyle, and I'll walk through each one of these steps in a couple, or each one of these groups in a couple slides. And then less than 1% of our native bees are social. These are the bumblebees. So let's walk through each one of those groups and see what they look like. So 70% of these are ground nesting bees. This is a nest underground, kind of excavated. It's solitary, so it's just one female building her nest. She creates this tunnel and then makes little cells. She brings pollen back, makes this little pollen bread or bee bread, they call it, lays an egg on it, seals up that cell, and then walks away from it, or builds another cell. But basically, she goes off and dies. And those eggs develop underground for how, you know, I actually have a slide on that coming up. But they often are found in drier, sandier soils. That's at least where we encounter them most. You might see these, like, I've seen them in urban areas, like along the asphalt of your driveway, where you just can't get grass to grow very well. They're those kind of bare spots. This is perfect habitat for ground nesting bees. The other 30% that are nesting in stems have a pretty similar lifestyle, where they're partitioning one cell at a time, provisioning it, and then closing it off and flying away. A lot of them are using stems that are already excavated, like like forb stems, like a monarda, or like a cup plant, these kind of hollow stems. There are a few exceptions. There's these small little bees called carpenter bees that actually prefer pithy stems that they can then go and clean out. But by and large, they're using stems that are already hollow. Or old beetle nests in trees. So some of them nest in wood, and they're using previously excavated holes. This is what it can look like kind of from a side view. That some bees will use mud or flower petals, or has anybody seen these leafcutter bee, evidence of leafcutter bees? They're like, you see a leaf and it has all of these circular kind of holes cut out of it.
I just thought it was caterpillars.
No, so, well, it could be, but more than likely you have some leafcutter bees that are living nearby. They actually cut out these huge jaws so they can carry around these big pieces of leaf. They carry that around, and then they'll actually line each one of their cells with those leaves. And what I want to point out about this slide is basically these cells can take a long time to provision. Each one of these little pollen wads can represent over 1,000 trips to flowers. So it's important to have nesting habitat next to your flowering habitat to minimize that effort, right? So this is what I was saying. This is kind of the life cycle. So let's pretend like it's spring. And you've got bees flying around. And they're flying sometimes all season long, but sometimes just for a very short window of a couple of weeks. And they have evolved to start flying during that period. And sometimes they are very tied to one specific plant family or plant genus. So they need those flowers to collect that particular kind of pollen. They're flying, they're collecting that pollen, they're provisioning some nests, and then underground or in a stem, those larvae are eating that pollen. They eventually pupate, and then they emerge and kind of do the whole thing over again. There's never overlapping generations like you would have in a honeybee colony, where you've got the mother overlapping with her young. In this kind of system, the mother never gets to meet her babies. The other thing that's important about understanding this life cycle is that we often think flowers, flowers, flowers for pollinator conservation. But really, their life is a lot more than just flowers. They need nest protection all year round, right? If they're going to get to that flower visiting stage. Okay, and then there's that weird group of bees called bumblebees that are our social native bees. They also have the caste system that honeybees do. But the unique thing about bumblebees is that they are only annual. Whereas honeybees overwinter, they live off of their honey storage. Bumblebees do not. And I'll show you the life cycle of a bumblebee in a second here. But they're annual, they create their colony each spring. They can have pretty small colonies of only about 25 workers, or it can be up to 500 workers. And they nest kind of all over the place. And I'm curious, by a show of hands, has anybody run into a bumblebee nest before? I always like to collect these stories because they can be all over. Where did you see one?
In a bird nest, a chickadee nest.
Yeah.
And in a mouse hole.
Right. Anybody else? Yeah, where did you see one?
Compost pile?
Yeah, okay. So the theme about bumblebee nests is they like to use something that's warm and cozy, something that they probably didn't create on their own. It's usually an old rodent nest or an old nest of some other kind that they basically didn't have to create. It's a hay pile, and I'll show you some examples in a second. But sometimes it's above ground, sometimes it's a little bit below ground. It's kind of all over the place. And the life cycle of the bumblebee is pretty interesting as well. So again, we're going to pretend like we're in spring, or that, like bumblebee queens are just about to start emerging. They emerge when flowers are out, and they start has anybody seen bumblebee queens? They're kind of just like patrolling, looking for a good nest site. So they're already mated. They're looking for a nesting site to start laying eggs. Once they find a good site, they'll lay a few eggs and get some more workers in the colony. In the beginning, it's all kind of on her. And then over the summer, they've got workers. They're mostly females in the colony. Eventually, later in the season, she lays eggs for new queens and males. At the end of the season, the males and those new queens kind of disperse, mate. Everybody dies except for the new queens. Those new queens then find a place underground, usually, to overwinter, and then the process starts again. So what I think is interesting to note here is that one of the most vulnerable times for bumblebees is this spring period, when the entire population really is dependent on these few individuals. And with restorations, it can often be challenging to get some of those early spring blooming species in our mixes or in our shrub plantings and so forth. And so making sure that we have a lot of good forage early in the season can really do a lot for bumblebee conservation. Okay. Bumblebee nests, just again to talk about kind of the various places that you can find them. Tall bunch grasses, straw mulch, compost piles, raised beds with a lot of organic matter. My colleague likes to tell the story about how she found one in like her junk pile in an old grill. I've seen them in like lawnmowers that have been sitting in outbuildings, kind of all over the place. And you can find out that they were rodent nests because at the end of the season, right, they all die. So if you remember where you saw it, you can go back at the end of the season and go investigate. And you see things like insulation and all these weird things that rodents would pull together, but not bumblebees. Okay, so just to wrap up those habitat requirements, all bees will need diverse flowers all season long. Some of them may only be flying for a short period, but in general, we need flowers all season long. They also need shelter for nesting, all season long, right? All winter long. And then something that I think we don't talk enough about is they all need refuge from pesticides as well. And so I'm going to go somewhat briefly through this part, but because this is a part of the talk that I often pitch towards farmers. But I think what you can do is pull some of the principles of the habitat opportunities into your landscape. You can kind of envision them in your own garden or your neighborhood. So one of the things we like to do at the Xerces Society is before we recommend putting in habitat, we like to assess what habitat you already have. Because a lot of people don't even recognize habitat that exists on their farms. Like, for example, you might think of that junk pile as something that you need to just bring to the dump that you haven't had the time to do yet, but in fact, that rock pile or that brush pile might be providing a lot of good habitat. So we like to assess the habitat you already have and protect that. And then figure out what your deficiencies are and design habitat to meet those deficiencies, right? So I'm a very visual person. I just like to look at maps like this or representations like this to think, oh, wet areas, riparian areas, sunflowers in the garden, understory under your apple orchard, maybe cover crops or these insectary strips kind of on the edges of your crop field. Lots of different places where insects can really thrive. So I'm going to walk through some of the opportunities that I usually recommend for farmers. And there are, just so you know, there are farm bill opportunities, financial assistance opportunities tied to most of these. So field borders is something we recommend, especially next to, like, this is a blueberry field where you need pollination services. Similarly, a field border next to a cranberry bog in New Hampshire. Again, this is also just aesthetically beautiful if you've got a U-pick operation or something. it's awesome to have this. Field borders, so another reason to have a field border without flowers, this one flowers kind of shouldn't be there. A field border of just strictly grasses can be a great way to create that spatial barrier between the crop that might be, where the farmer might be using conventional pesticides, and then on this side, off the screen here, is an organic farm. So this is a non-flowering barrier that's not going to attract pollinators where there might be pesticide drift. So that also is a pollinator conservation measure. Flowering cover crops, and you don't have to have a lot of acres for this actually. I've talked to people who have done a flowering cover crop of like Phacelia in their entire front yard. So it can work on lots of different scales. Tree and shrub plantings, this is a great way to get that early season flowering resources in your landscape because early season forbs can be quite expensive for prairie mixes, so starting with shrubs can be a great way to get those flowers. They can also produce edible fruits. And I just want to point out, because this is going to lead into the next slide, this is that organic blueberry farm up here. Blueberries up here, they're a flowering hedgerow right here, and then they've got conifers back here, okay? So just to orient you. This is that same farm, these are those conifers in the back row. There, on the other side of this field is their conventional neighbor doing a corn and soy rotation with potential for pesticide drift. So they've got their conifer windbreak, then they've got additional insectary habitat over here, and then they've got blueberries right off the screen. And then, as the previous speaker was mentioning, habitat management is really key. So once we put it in, we can't just walk away, we have to be actively disturbing it. And there are a lot of different ways to do it. Grazing can be a really effective tool, burning. This is an experiment that my colleague was part of where they were testing out conservation haying. And so this is a strip that was hayed in the fall, and in the spring there's just this flush of lupins. And actually what you can't really see is that there are lupins in these other non-hayed areas. But this is just so visually appealing for a bee. You know, you can just see that in the landscape. And so I can imagine that not only is it attractive to bees and pollinators, but I'm sure it's useful to have that habitat heterogeneity for other wildlife as well. Okay, so this is that part where we talk about some of the recent numbers and kind of scare you into some action, because we're in kind of a dire situation with insect numbers lately. So it's probably no surprise to you that pollinators are in decline. There's just mounting evidence in managed and wild pollinators. In October of 2017, there was a study that came out of Germany, a 3-decade-long study where they were measuring insect biomass, sweep nets. They would just walk through with sweep nets and just saw a 75 or 76% decline in insect biomass of flying insects. And this was in nature preserves, right, where in theory nature's protected. Last year, there was another long-term study that came out of Puerto Rico, similar kinds of methods where they were measuring insect biomass, and they saw a 60-fold decrease in insect biomass in these nature preserves. And not only that, they actually measured the consequences on insect-eating birds and lizards and found serious declines in those animals as well. So what we're seeing here is really the ecosystem is being obliterated from the bottom up, right? So it's not just Germany. I mean, this is kind of all over. And this is a study that just came out this winter in January or February. And I'm going to walk you through this really quickly. This was a study that tried to summarize all the insect decline literature. So they were just focused on the insect declines, but they found some really interesting results when they summarized everything that's been published. So I'll walk through this one first. So we've got this x-axis, there's lots of different kinds of insects. So we've got like dung beetles is this really tall bar here. I've got butterflies right here, moths, bees, right? Okay, and then on the y-axis, we have the proportion of the species. So on a scale of 0 to 1, you can think of this as a percentage. So for example, dung beetles, approximately 80 or 90% of the species are either declining, vulnerable, endangered, or extinct. So a huge proportion of those species are at risk. So the big ones that are at decline are these dung beetles, moths and butterflies and bees. I mean, basically the story is like a lot of these, average 50% of these insects are in decline. And then the next one, the study was really trying to get at what are the drivers of these declines. So this chart shows kind of the different drivers. There's habitat change, pollution, biological traits, so that's like phenology, when things come out, and then climate change. And so again, that y-axis is the number of reports that they pooled together. So 80 reports, approximately 80 reports, showed that habitat change was the biggest driving factor in the decline of beetles. This is all different orders of insects. So beetles, the Hymenoptera, which is like bees and wasps. So basically, yeah, 80% of these reports are showing that habitat change is a major factor in insect declines. Pollution is a big factor, biological traits, and so forth. Okay, and honeybees, I am going to bring it back to honeybees for just a second because honeybees, declines in honeybees really captured the attention of the public. And that is why we conjure up the image of honeybee, right? When we think about pollinator conservation. So because before 1995, we saw an average of 10 to 15% loss of honeybee hives every year for beekeepers. Now, and then it kind of jumped up to 22% winter loss per year. Now, I know this is going to be hard for you guys to see, but basically, we're looking at an average of about 40% loss in the last 10 years, every year, for beekeepers. And so this is costly for beekeepers to be doing this, right? They're losing honeybees. They have to keep rebuilding those populations so that they can keep bringing them to pollinate the almonds, the apples, kind of moving them around the country to do this. It's costly, right? And we know that native bees are also in decline, although it is significantly more challenging to learn about native bees because they have that solitary life cycle, and we can't just like look in their box and find out what their numbers are doing. But we do know a little bit. Some groups we know a lot more about. Bumblebees in particular we know more about because there's a long history of collecting bumblebees. So we have a lot of bees in our insect collections, and so we do have some sense of what their populations are, or at least where they were then and now. And through these studies, we've discovered that about a quarter to a third of our bumblebees are at risk of extinction. Some of these you might have heard of. The rusty patch bumblebee has a last stronghold in Minnesota and Wisconsin. This is the first bumblebee to be listed on the Federal Endangered Species Act. But there are a few others that are candidates. There are 7 yellow-faced bees. These are small little bees that are on the Endangered Species Act in Hawaii. Anyway, there are not many native bees on the Endangered Species Act, but that's because we're still learning about their life history, right, and their populations. So this is the part where I'm going to explain the threats, and I want you to flip those and think about how you can kind of tap into addressing some of those threats, right? Because we all kind of are connected. We all have capacity to make some change. And we all have different interests in participating in different ways. So I'll talk about each one of these and then think about how you can be involved. So habitat loss is, like we saw on that figure, a really, really big one. That's because of conversion to agriculture, to urban development. It's loss of plant diversity across landscapes in general. Pesticide use is a big one, and that's not just an agricultural issue. This is a big issue in urban areas as well for mosquito control and even just common garden pesticides. Diseases can occur when we're moving honeybees around, but also people buy commercial bumblebees for pollination services. Those can sometimes have disease that they share with native populations. So disease can be a factor in pollinator decline. Invasive species, and I'm thinking here about like plant species. There are a lot of invasive plant species that some of them may even provide nectar and pollen resources. Like probably a lot of you have seen butterflies swarming Canada thistle or something, you know. But remember that chickadee example about how insects need native plants to grow? Like there aren't a lot of native insects that are co-evolved with Canada thistle, for example. So we need to be taking out those invasive species and supplanting them with native species. Competition between honeybees and native bees is a documented threat. Land management impacts. This is a tricky one because we want that disturbance to kind of rejuvenate our prairies, but we also need to be careful about how often we're doing it, right? And then climate change is one that matters because of that synchrony between certain pollinators and the flowers that they need. So climate change is definitely being a serious threat to pollinators. So this is we really need all hands on deck to solve this issue, not just for pollinators, but for all insects out there, for the beetles, the grasshoppers I saw in a lot of these pictures, the grasshoppers, for the base of the food chain, so that all of the other wildlife and us really can be supported. So we need to protect existing habitat, we need to create new habitat, however small. We need to educate ourselves and others. Go put a sign in your yard saying, this is not weeds, this is pollinator habitat. And then participate in policy making. So if that's pollinator-friendly solar or right-of-way management, be involved in your township decision-making on how your roadsides are managed. Just kind of jump in wherever you can, wherever you feel most comfortable, because we need you to. Okay, and so I guess I'll just leave it there since I know I'm probably running late already and I don't want, and I really want to hear Thelma's talk. But I'm happy to answer a few questions if there are any. Yeah?
You talked about early pollinating sources. Would dandelions be included in that category of early sources of pollen for
definitely.
bees?
I would say dandelions are important, and I wouldn't go planting any, but I wouldn't go remove them either. Does that make sense?
Right.
Like they're not part of a seed mix or like a strategy for conservation, but certainly we need to change the aesthetic of like removing all dandelions from our landscape.
Oh, people put herbicides on them as well, you know that.
Yeah.
I mean that's.
They're definitely important.
What other things would be examples of early pollinators, pollen sources in
A lot of
this climate?
our woody species actually.
So like
Things that you
fruit
wouldn't even think, like fruit trees or even maples, honestly. They're up in the canopy, so you're not really seeing them as often, but they do attract a lot of early season pollinators. Willows are excellent attractants for early season pollen and nectar. So the spring ephemeral wildflowers in the understory, those are a little harder to establish from from seed or from a kind of even nursery perspective, but those are important for sure.
Just one other thing. They're talking about in Wisconsin increasing the vegetation between water sources and farmers' fields from 15 feet to 30 feet. if that became law, and they're incentivizing, farmers to do that, I mean, they're getting funds to do that. But, the purpose is to prevent soil erosion and phosphorus pollution in waterways. How would this tie in, kind of what you're talking about with those barriers? I
Yeah.
mean, would that strip of land be a good source for pollinating, plants, or how could you kind of dovetail what you're talking about into,
Sure.
this need for more, land barriers between waterways and.
Yeah, so those buffer areas, I think, potentially are a good starting point, because, yeah, there are a lot of shrubs that would do really well there, dogwoods, willows, and that kind of thing. There are two things that concern me. One is that potentially there's a lot of pesticide drift that would be captured in that area, even just from runoff in soil. Some of these pesticides get kind of captured in water and then get stuck in the soil in that buffer zone. And then they're systemic pesticides, so they'll be taken up into all plant tissues in that buffer zone and potentially poisonous to whatever insects eating that plant. So that is one risk. The other thing that can be tricky about those buffer zones is that often they're really thick with like reed canary grass, which can make it expensive to throw down a seed mix that's high cost. So that's why I think putting in something with shrubs or something that's already kind of a mature plant that's competitive, that might be able to fight off some of that reed canary grass might be a good way to go. But I think it's a good potential. I mean, if it's protected, then it's certainly a great opportunity for a marginal area that could be, and also create corridors potentially along the waterways for wildlife movement. So, yeah.
What about windrows? What would be good kind of choices, not only to eliminate or cut down on wind erosion, but also help pollinators?
I guess the choices are not vast, but there are quite a lot. And so I guess I don't have a shrub list over here, but it's something that we're working on. And also just to make sure that for time management, maybe we can talk afterwards, and we can just email about it. I can send you a long list. Is that okay?